Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we journey through the complete lore of Skyrim's Greybeards, the silent order who wait at the top of the world, guarding a power born in an ancient war. One they learned long ago was too dangerous to ever speak aloud. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what games you want me to cover next. And subscribe if this helps you sleep. The voice before men. Long before the first Nord ever set foot on the tundra of Skyrim, before the first stone of High Hrothgar was ever laid, the voice belonged to no one but the sky itself. This is where the story of the Greybeards truly begins, not with an old man in grey robes climbing a mountain, but with a power so old that mortals had no word for it, because mortals were not yet permitted to use it. In the Merethic era, in the long grey dawn before recorded history, the dragons ruled all of Mundus, and the source of their rule was a single, terrible gift. The dragons could shout. Their word was the voice, and when a dragon spoke, the world listened whether it wanted to or not. The etched tablets that line the 7,000 steps to this day still carry the memory of that age, describing how, before the birth of men, the dragon's voice could blot out the sky and flood the land. It is worth sitting with that image for a moment. Not a voice that could merely command an army or knock down a gate. A voice so vast that it could darken the heavens and drown a valley, simply because a dragon chose to speak. There is an interesting wrinkle in how this origin came to be remembered by later generations of Nords. One worth mentioning here because it resurfaces throughout this entire story in subtle ways. Most contemporary Nords, by the time of the Fourth Era, do not actually credit Paarthurnax directly when they speak of how mankind first received the voice. The popular belief instead holds that the Thu'um was taught to mortals by the daughters of Kine, a more comfortable and more purely divine explanation that leaves dragons out of the story entirely, framing the gift as something passed from goddess to worshipper without any uncomfortable draconic intermediary involved. The truth that a dragon, and specifically Alduin's own brother, was the one who actually knelt beside the earliest tongues and taught them the mechanics of shouting, was apparently kept quiet for centuries. Whether deliberately obscured by the earliest Greybeards themselves, or simply smoothed over naturally as oral tradition passed from one generation to the next, and slowly reshaped an uncomfortable truth into a tidier legend. It stands to reason that this quiet erasure served the interests of nearly everyone involved. The Nords could take pride in a gift given directly by their gods, rather than begrudgingly borrowed from a former oppressor. And Paarthurnax, hiding above High Hrothgar for thousands of years under a name and a role that concealed his true nature entirely, had every reason of his own to let that simpler story stand uncorrected. Men, when they finally arrived on the surface of the world, were born weak beneath that shadow. The stone record along the pilgrim's path is blunt about this. Men were born and spread across the face of Mundus, and the dragons presided over them like a farmer presides over crawling insects in a field. Humanity in that era had no voice of its own, no way to answer power with power. There is something almost unbearably lonely in that image, if you let yourself sit inside it the way the Greybeards ask their pilgrims to. Imagine standing on open ground with nothing above you but a sky that could, at any moment, decide to end you, and having absolutely no language with which to argue back. The fledgling spirits of early men were not entirely passive, though. According to the same carved history, they were unafraid to war with the dragons and their voices even in those early hopeless days. But every uprising ended the same way. The dragons only shouted them down and broke their hearts, generation after generation, until it must have seemed as though defiance itself was simply another kind of foolishness. And then something changed. Nordic tradition holds that it was Kine, goddess of the sky and of battle, who looked down on that crushed and grieving people and felt something like pity. Kine is remembered by the Nords as the wife of Shor and the mother figure who breathed life onto the throat of the world when men were first created there, which is itself part of why the mountain became sacred ground centuries before the Greybeards ever founded their order upon it. According to the legend the Greybeards themselves preserve, Kine called upon a dragon, one dragon among the many tyrants of that era, and asked him to pity mankind rather than rule it. The dragon's name was Paarthurnax. We will spend much more time with him later in this story, because his fate becomes inseparable from the fate of the order he eventually leads. But here, at the very beginning, all that matters is this single act of rebellion against his own kind. Paarthurnax, moved by whatever mixture of conviction, resentment toward his brother Alduin, or genuine compassion drove him, chose to do what no dragon had ever done. He taught men to use the voice. This is the true origin of everything the Greybeards would eventually become, and it stands to reason that without this single act of betrayal against dragonkind, the entire philosophy of the way of the voice would never have had anything to grow from. Paarthurnax began instructing a small circle of early Nords in the mechanics of the Thu'um, teaching them to understand that the dragon tongue was not simply noise, but structured language, words layered with meaning that, when spoken with true understanding, could bend reality itself. These first students became known as the Tongues, and they were the very first mortals in the history of Mundus to wield a power that had, until that moment, belonged exclusively to dragons. It is difficult to overstate how radical this was. The natural order of the world at that time held that dragons were gods, quite literally worshipped as divine beings by cults that would later be remembered as the dragon cult, complete with masked priests who ruled over human settlements as though they were extensions of draconic will. For a dragon to hand mortals a piece of that divine authority was not simply generous, it was closer to heresy. It is worth understanding just how total the dragon's dominion over early mankind actually was before Paarthurnax's rebellion, because without that context, the scale of what he risked becomes difficult to appreciate. The dragons did not simply rule from a distance, content to let mortals live beneath their shadow undisturbed. They were worshipped directly, treated as living gods by structured religious institutions that would come to be remembered as the dragon cult, a hierarchy of masked human priests who served as intermediaries between ordinary Nords and their draconic overlords. These priests wielded considerable power in their own right, and based on what we know of the dragon cult structure, it stands to reason that some of them may have eventually gained enough favor to be granted some portion of the voice themselves, though presumably always as a gift bestowed from above rather than a birthright claimed independently. The masks these priests wore were said to reflect the will and the personality of the dragon each priest served, a detail that speaks to just how thoroughly draconic authority had woven itself into the spiritual architecture of the era. To teach ordinary tongues, warriors and common men rather than sanctioned priests was to bypass this entire structure completely, offering the voice not as a control gift filtered through religious hierarchy, but as something closer to birthright, learned directly and without the permission of the very gods whose authority the dragon cult existed to enforce. One interpretation of why Paarthurnax's actions were considered so severe a betrayal is precisely this. that he did not merely defy his brother Alduin in some private or personal sense, but tore down the entire theological justification an empire of dragons had built to explain why mankind ought to remain subservient in the first place. The early tongues did not use this new power gently. This is a detail that the modern Greybeards, in their silence and their pacifism, tend to obscure. But the historical record preserved across Skyrim's lore is fairly consistent on the point. The first generation of voice-wielding Nords used the Thuum as a weapon of war, and they used it well. Great Nordic war chiefs of that early age, men remembered in fragments as Derek the Tall, Jorg Helmborg, and Hogmer Killer, were themselves tongues, and they needed no siege engines to break a city's defences. They simply shouted the gates down and let their armies pour through the breach. This detail matters enormously for understanding where the Greybeards' philosophy eventually comes from, because it establishes, right at the root of the story, that the voice was born into violence twice. First, dragons used it to enslave humanity. Then humanity, once it finally gained access to that same power, turned around and used it exactly the same way, as an instrument of conquest rather than a gift to be honored. The stage for everything that follows, the entire pacifist philosophy that eventually defines the Greybeards, is set by this early and uncomfortable truth. Power, once seized, tends to be used as a weapon regardless of who is holding it. It would take an entire war, and centuries more after that, before a single Nord finally stopped to ask whether that had to remain true forever. Before that reckoning could come, though, the rebellion against the dragons had to reach its climax, because Kain's gift to Paarthurnax's chosen students was never intended merely to arm a few ambitious war chiefs. It was intended to end the age of dragon dominion entirely, and that meant war on a scale the young world had not yet seen. The tongues that Paarthurnax personally trained became the vanguard of a rebellion that would eventually be remembered as the Dragon War, a conflict so old and so foundational to Nordic identity that its exact chronology has been lost to the fog of the Merethic era, blurred together with myth until historians can no longer say with certainty how many decades or centuries it actually spanned. What is remembered clearly, carved into stone and passed down through skaldic verse for thousands of years, is that this was the war in which mortals finally proved that their voice could stand equal to the voice of dragons. It is worth remembering, as we move forward into the next chapter of this story, that everything the Greybeards represent today, the silence, the discipline, the mountaintop isolation, grows directly out of the ashes of that war. Before there was a way of the voice, there was simply the voice, wild and untempered, wielded by desperate mortals fighting for the right to exist beneath a sky that no longer wanted to crush them. The rebellion at the throat of the world. The Dragon War did not end quietly, and it did not end in the lowlands where most of the fighting had taken place for years. It ended atop the very mountain that would one day cradle High Hrothgar, the peak the Nords call the throat of the world, the tallest point in all of Tamriel. This detail alone should tell you something about how deeply intertwined the mountain and the war truly are. Long before any monastery existed on that summit, long before any Greybeard ever took a vow of silence within its halls, the throat of the world was already sacred ground, already scarred by combat between gods and mortals. The dragon Paarthurnax himself confirms this directly to the last Dragonborn centuries later, revealing that the throat of the world was, in fact, the battleground where the ancient Nords fought Alduin and brought the Dragon War to its final, desperate conclusion. At the heart of that final battle stood 3 mortal heroes whose names are still spoken with reverence by anyone who studies Nordic history closely. Gormlai Golden Hilt, Hakon One Eye, and Feldir the Old. These 3 were the chief tongues of their generation, the most accomplished students to emerge from Paarthurnax's teaching, and it was they who devised something no mortal had ever created before. A shout built entirely by human hands, containing no borrowed dragon wisdom, no divine gift passed down from kine. This new shout was called Dragonrend, and its purpose was almost philosophical in nature before it was ever tactical. Dragonrend did not simply damage a dragon the way a blade or an arrow might. It forced the concept of mortality itself into a dragon's mind, an idea so utterly foreign to an immortal creature that Paarthurnax himself would later describe it, in halting reflection, as something close to incomprehensible to the Dove, the dragonkind. One interpretation, supported by the way Paarthurnax speaks of the shout centuries afterward, with a kind of pained reverence, suggests that Dragonrend was less a weapon in the conventional sense and more a kind of forced philosophical awakening, an assault not on a dragon's body, but on the very foundation of how it understood its own existence. When Gormlaith, Hakon, and Feldir finally turned Dragonrend against Alduin himself atop the throat of the world, the effect was immediate and visceral. Alduin, the World Eater, regarded by some Nords as another aspect of Akatosh himself, rather than a separate being entirely, was forced down out of the sky and into the mortal plane of combat, stripped for the first time of the absolute invulnerability his divine nature had always afforded him. What followed was ferocious. Alduin fought the 3 heroes directly, and the cost was steep. Gormlith Golden Hilt fell in that battle, cut down by the World Eater even as her companions continued to press the fight, a sacrifice that Nordic legend has never allowed to be forgotten. With Gormlith gone, Hakon urged Feldir toward a final and desperate measure, one that went beyond even the boldness of Dragonrend itself. They would use an Elder Scroll, one of the great artifacts of forbidden and dangerous knowledge that even the ancient Nords understood to be perilous beyond ordinary comprehension. Feldir the Old activated the Elder Scroll in the midst of that raging battle, and the effect tore something loose in the fabric of time itself. Alduin, mid-combat, mid-roar, was hurled forward through the centuries, banished not to some distant realm, but to a future moment that the ancient Nords could not have predicted or controlled. The place where this rupture occurred became known afterward as the Time Wound, a permanent scar in reality located at the very summit of the throat of the world, a wound that Paarthurnax would go on to guard, alone, for thousands upon thousands of years. It stands to reason that this act, more than any other single moment in the entire history of the voice, is the true reason the Greybeards eventually chose that particular mountain as the site of their monastery. The throat of the world was not simply the tallest point in Tamriel. It was the place where mortals had, at ruinous cost, first proven their power could rival that of the divine, and it was also the place where that victory was revealed to be incomplete. This is a detail that too many retellings of Skyrim's history smooth over in the interest of a tidier story, but it deserves to be spoken plainly here, because it directly shapes everything the Greybeards eventually become. Alduin was not truly defeated in that battle. He was postponed. The ancient Nords did not kill the World Eater. They could not. Even Dragonrend, even the sacrifice of Gormlai Golden Hilt, even the terrible and unpredictable power of an Elder Scroll, was not enough to end him permanently. All they managed to achieve was delay, buying the world thousands of years of relative peace at the cost of leaving a wound in time that would, eventually, have to be reckoned with by some future generation. Paarthurnax understood this immediately, and it is part of why he made the choice that would define the remainder of his impossibly long existence. Rather than returning to his kind, rather than resuming whatever place he might have reclaimed among the surviving dragons, Paarthurnax withdrew to the summit of the very mountain where the time wound had opened, and he waited there. He did not know when Alduin would return. He only knew, with the patient certainty of an immortal being who has learned to think in centuries rather than seasons, that the day would eventually come. It is worth pausing to consider what the time wound actually represented to those who first witnessed its creation, because the ancient Nords who survived that final confrontation atop the mountain did not fully understand, in the moment, what they had actually done. They had not closed a door. They had torn one open and then abandoned the room on the other side of it, uncertain whether anything might eventually come through. The tradition holds that some among the ancient Nords hoped, in the aftermath of that desperate battle, that Alduin would simply be lost forever, cast so far forward through time that he would never surface again within any age they needed to worry about. Paarthurnax, according to his own later reflection on this period, understood better than any mortal present that this hope was almost certainly false. Time, as he would eventually describe it in far more measured words centuries later, flows ever onward, and a being cast forward through its current does not vanish so much as wait, patient and untouched by the intervening centuries, for the moment the current eventually delivers him back into the world. This understanding is precisely why Paarthurnax chose to remain, rather than departing to rejoin whatever society of dragons might have still existed elsewhere on Tamriel in the aftermath of their defeat. He did not know when his brother would resurface. He only knew where, and he considered that knowledge sufficient reason to spend the whole of his remaining existence, however many thousands of years that might ultimately prove to be, standing guard over a wound in reality that most of Tamriel would eventually forget had ever been opened at all. This decision by Paarthurnax to remain in silent vigil above the time wound is, in many ways, the true spiritual seed of everything the Greybeards eventually become as an order. Long before Jurgen Windcaller ever climbed that mountain, long before the first stone of High Hrothgar was laid, there was already a precedent being set at that exact location. A being of immense and terrible power, choosing isolation, choosing patience, choosing quiet vigilance over the more immediate rewards of conquest or glory, all in service of something larger than the individual self. When the first Nord builders eventually arrived on that mountaintop to construct their monastery, they were, whether they fully understood it or not, planting their order directly on top of the oldest lesson the voice had to teach. That power, wielded without restraint, wins battles but not wars, and that some victories can only be measured properly across the span of many human lifetimes. The tongues who fought and bled at the throat of the world did not know it yet, but their war had not ended. It had simply gone quiet, the way a coal goes quiet beneath ash, still burning, still dangerous, waiting for the wind that would eventually stir it awake again. Jurgen Windcaller and the 7-year meditation. Centuries passed after the banishment of Alduin, and the militant tradition of the tongues did not fade. If anything, it grew more entrenched, more celebrated, more central to what it meant to be a great Nordic warrior. Among the greatest of these later tongues, a warrior who would come to be remembered by history as possessing perhaps the single most powerful Thu'um the First Era ever produced, was a man named Jurgen Windcaller. Before the world knew him as Jurgen the Calm, before his name became synonymous with silence and restraint, Jurgen was something else entirely. He was a militant wielder of the voice, in the oldest and most aggressive tradition of the tongues. A man who understood the Thu'um the way his ancestors had always understood it, as a weapon to be sharpened and a source of strength to be grown through use in battle. By every account that survives, Jurgen was extraordinary even among his fellow tongues, feared and respected in equal measure, a man whose shout alone could reportedly turn the tide of a battlefield. It helps to understand exactly what kind of reputation Jurgen carried into that battle, because the depth of his eventual transformation only makes sense against the backdrop of just how celebrated he was beforehand. By the time of the confrontation at Red Mountain, Jurgen was already spoken of as possibly the single strongest tongue the First Era had yet produced, a warrior whose shout was said to carry enough raw force to end a skirmish before it properly began. Men who fought alongside him in earlier campaigns are remembered as having followed him specifically because his voice alone was worth more on a battlefield than an entire company of ordinary soldiers. This was not a man who had ever known meaningful defeat, and it stands to reason that a lifetime of unbroken martial success would have left him, like so many of his contemporaries among the tongues, with an unquestioned assumption that the strength of his voice was simply a fact of the world, as reliable and unshakable as the mountains themselves. It is precisely this unshakable confidence that made the defeat at Red Mountain so devastating, not merely as a military loss, but as a rupture in Jurgen's entire understanding of his own place in the order of things. This reputation, and the confidence it bred, was tested and ultimately shattered at the Battle of Red Mountain, one of the defining military catastrophes in early Nordic history. The Nordic armies, Jurgen among their most powerful champions, marched to war believing, as they always had, that the strength of their voice would carry them to victory the way it always had before. Instead, they suffered an utterly ignominious defeat, a rout so severe and so humiliating that it shook the very foundations of what Nordic warriors believed about their own power. This is worth pausing on, because the defeat at Red Mountain was not simply a military loss. For a culture that had built centuries of identity around the supremacy of the voice, around the unbroken assumption that a strong enough shout could overcome any obstacle, the crushing failure of that assumption on the battlefield represented something closer to a crisis of faith. If the voice could fail this badly, despite the presence of a tongue as powerful as Jurgen Windcaller among their ranks, then something fundamental about how the Nords understood their own strength had to be wrong. Jurgen did not return from that defeat and immediately seek vengeance or attempt to rebuild his martial reputation through some new campaign, the way so many of his contemporaries might have. Instead, he withdrew from the world entirely. What followed is remembered in Greybeard tradition as the 7-year meditation, a period during which Jurgen isolated himself in contemplation, turning the defeat over and over in his mind, searching not for tactical explanations, but for something deeper. He looked inward for answers as to why the strength of their voices had failed them, refusing simpler explanations like poor strategy or an unusually strong enemy, and instead pursuing a question that most warriors of his era would never have thought to ask at all. Why had the voice, which had always been treated as an unstoppable birthright, suddenly proven insufficient? Over the course of those 7 long years, One interpretation of the historical record suggests that Jurgen essentially reconstructed the entire history of the Thu'um from first principles, meditating not just on his own failure, but on the deeper origin of the power itself, tracing it back through the generations of war chiefs who had used it as a weapon, and further back still, to the age of the dragons, when the voice had belonged exclusively to beings who ruled through domination rather than wisdom. It was through this long and painful process of introspection that Jurgen finally arrived at the conclusion that would define the remainder of his life and give birth to an entirely new philosophy. He came to believe that the Nords, in wielding the voice so casually and so aggressively as an instrument of war and conquest, had grown arrogant, echoing in a chilling and deliberate way the exact same arrogance that had once defined the dragons themselves in the age before the Dragon War. The evidence points toward Jurgen recognizing an uncomfortable symmetry. The voice had first been used by dragons to dominate mankind. Mankind had won its freedom from that domination, only to turn around and use the same power to dominate each other and dominate their neighbors, and eventually suffer a humiliating defeat that felt, to Jurgen at least, like a kind of cosmic correction. From this realization, Jurgen developed the philosophy that would come to be known as the Way of the Voice, and it represented an almost total inversion of everything Nordic tradition had previously taught about the Thu'um. Rather than treating the voice as primarily a tool of war, a way to grow personal strength or achieve martial dominance over rivals, Jurgen concluded that the true and proper use of the voice was for the worship and glory of the gods, and that violence should be considered, at most, the very least worthy application of a gift that deserved to be treated with far greater reverence. This did not mean, and it is important to be precise here, that Jurgen believed the voice should never be used for defense or in moments of genuine necessity. The philosophy he articulated, and which the Greybeards preserve faithfully even into the modern era, holds that followers of the Way are expected to remain fundamentally peaceful, with violence reserved as an absolute last resort, permissible only in circumstances of what the tradition calls true need. But the emphasis of the entire philosophy shifted dramatically away from conquest and towards something closer to devotion, contemplation, and a disciplined, almost meditative relationship with a power that Jurgen now understood to be sacred, rather than merely useful. It stands to reason that this philosophical transformation did not come easily, or without personal cost to Jurgen himself. He had spent the greater part of his life as a warrior, celebrated for the very qualities his new philosophy now asked him, and eventually his followers, to set aside almost entirely. There is a particular kind of courage required to look honestly at the foundation of your own reputation, your own accomplishments, and conclude that they were built on a mistaken understanding of the power that made them possible. Jurgen Windcaller, once one of the most feared tongues in the First Era, chose to become something almost unrecognizable from the warrior he had been before Red Mountain. He chose silence over the roar of the battlefield, contemplation over conquest, and in doing so he set in motion an order that would still be practicing his exact philosophy thousands of years later, largely unchanged, atop the very mountain where the ancient tongues had once bled to banish a god. It is worth noting that Jurgen Windcaller's own story did not end with his eventual death and burial at Ustengrav. Nordic belief holds that a warrior who lives honorably enough will eventually find their way to Sovngarde, the great hall of the dead where heroes feast and await the end of the world. And Jurgen is counted among those who completed that journey successfully, despite having spent the second half of his life turning away from the very martial glory that most souls bound for that hall are remembered for. Travelers who eventually reach that distant hall centuries later can find him there still, dressed in the same simple Greybeards robes he wore throughout his years at High Hrothgar, rather than in any armor or finery that might otherwise befit a warrior's paradise. A quiet detail that speaks volumes about which version of himself Jurgen ultimately considered his truest. When spoken to, he offers a brief but pointed reflection on the order he left behind, remarking that his disciples still follow the difficult path, and that the way of the voice is neither wide nor easy, before adding a final warning that those who stray from wisdom will not find their own way back to that same hall. Even in death, even resting among heroes remembered chiefly for battle rather than for silence, Jurgen Windcaller apparently remained exactly what he became after Red Mountain. A teacher still measuring the worth of a life by its discipline rather than by its glory. The 17 disciples and the building of High Hrothgar. When Jurgen Windcaller emerged from his 7 years of solitary meditation, he did not return to a warm welcome. This is a part of the story that deserves far more attention than it typically receives, because it reveals just how radical and how threatening his new philosophy appeared to the Nordic society of his time. The way of the voice was not simply a personal spiritual awakening that Jurgen quietly practiced on his own. He began to preach it publicly, actively challenging the deeply held cultural assumption that the Thu'um existed primarily to be sharpened into a weapon. And many of his fellow tongues, men and women, who had spent their own lives mastering the voice specifically for its martial applications, did not take kindly to being told that their entire approach to their own power was rooted in the same arrogance that had once damned the dragons. According to the tradition preserved by the Greybeards themselves, this resistance eventually escalated into direct confrontation. 17 other masters of the voice, warriors who rejected Jurgen's new philosophy and viewed it as a betrayal of everything the tongues were meant to represent, sought him out and confronted him, essentially challenging him to a battle of shouts, as though the matter could be settled the way any dispute among tongues had traditionally been settled, through raw demonstration of power. What happened next has become one of the most quietly remarkable moments in the entire history of the Order, precisely because of how thoroughly it embodies the philosophy Jurgen was trying to teach. Jurgen did not fight back. He did not attempt to overpower his 17 challengers with a superior shout of his own, even though, by every account of his abilities before Red Mountain, he likely could have. Instead, he simply endured. He absorbed, or in the language the tradition uses, swallowed, the shouts directed at him for days on end, refusing to answer violence with violence, refusing to prove his point through domination even when domination was well within his power. This detail matters enormously, and it's worth sitting with for a moment before moving forward, because it establishes something the Greybeards would carry forward as a core tenet of their order for thousands of years afterward. Jurgen won that confrontation not by demonstrating that his voice was stronger than his opponents, but by demonstrating that he was willing to endure their full strength without retaliating, until his 17 attackers, one by one, simply exhausted themselves. There is a particular kind of power in that image that no amount of martial dominance could ever replicate. Imagine 17 of the most accomplished tongues of an entire generation, hurling everything they had at a single man day after day, and that man simply remaining standing, unmoved, unretaliating, until exhaustion did what force could not. Seeing this, witnessing firsthand a strength that operated on principles entirely foreign to everything they understood about the voice, the 17 who had come to destroy Jurgen instead became his first disciples. They abandoned their opposition to the way of the voice, not because they were defeated in the conventional sense, but because they were shown something they had never conceived of before, a strength built on restraint rather than release. With these 17 former rivals now bound to him as followers, Jurgen Windcaller set about building a permanent home for the philosophy he had discovered, and he chose, deliberately and with clear intention, the same mountain where the ancient Nords had once fought Alduin to a costly standstill. High Hrothgar, named for the region surrounding it, rose atop the throat of the world as a secluded monastery specifically designed to allow its inhabitants to attune themselves ever more closely to what the tradition calls the voice of the sky, the same divine wind that Nordic legend holds Kine herself breathed across this exact peak when mankind was first created there. The choice of location was not incidental. It tied Jurgen's new philosophy directly back to the oldest and most sacred ground in all of Nordic religious tradition, a place already thick with the memory of sacrifice, of divine intervention, and of the terrible cost that came with wielding power carelessly. Building a monastery of restraint and silence directly atop the site of history's greatest demonstration of unrestrained divine violence carries a weight that feels almost too deliberate to be coincidence. The order that Jurgen founded at High Hrothgar took the name the Greybeards, sometimes recorded in older texts as the Men of the Throat, and their central practice from the very beginning was built around silence, not as an incidental byproduct of their isolation, but as a deliberate spiritual discipline unto itself. There is a small but telling piece of naming tradition worth pausing on before moving further into the order's history. Individual members of the Greybeards, though almost never referred to this way in ordinary conversation, are technically still called tongues, the very same title carried by the ancient warriors of Jurgen's own youth and by the militant voice wielders who came before them all the way back to the earliest days of the Dragon War. This continuity of title matters more than it might first appear. The Greybeards did not invent an entirely new vocabulary to distance themselves from the martial tradition Jurgen was reacting against. They kept the old word tongue and simply poured a new philosophy into it, transforming what had once meant a warrior skilled enough to shout down a city gate into something closer to a devoted scholar of restraint. It stands to reason that this choice was deliberate rather than accidental, a quiet reminder woven into the order's own self-description that the way of the voice was never meant to reject the power of the Thu'um itself, only the arrogance with which it had previously been wielded. The mountain they call home carries a similarly layered name. The throat of the world is not simply a poetic flourish invented by later generations of Nords admiring the view from Ivarstead. It reflects the same belief carved into the very first tablet along the pilgrim's path, that this specific peak is where Kine breathed life into mankind, meaning the mountain's name and the order's own title, as Men of the Throat, both point back toward the identical foundational myth, mankind's birth and the divine breath, or voice, that gave it form. The reasoning behind this silence deserves careful explanation, because it is easy to mistake it for simple asceticism or eccentric monkish tradition, when in fact it grows directly out of the raw physics of the power these men now wielded. As practitioners deepened their mastery of the Thu'um under Jurgen's tutelage, their voices grew correspondingly more powerful, to the point where even an ordinary spoken sentence carried enough latent force to become genuinely dangerous to anyone standing nearby who lacked the training to withstand it. The most accomplished Greybeards, over years and eventually decades of disciplined practice, developed voices so potent that even a whisper directed carelessly at another person could prove fatal. Silence, therefore, was not merely symbolic of humility or restraint in the abstract sense, though it certainly represented that as well. It was also, quite literally, a practical necessity born from the raw destructive potential the Greybeards carried within their own throats every single day of their lives. Beyond the philosophical reasoning behind the location, the physical act of constructing a monastery at that altitude, on a peak so remote and so hostile that even in the Fourth Era, it remains dangerous for a fully equipped adventurer to reach, speaks to the sheer determination Jurgen and his 17 disciples must have carried into the project. High Hrothgar as it stands today is no simple hermitage of a few rough shelters. It is a substantial structure of carved stone halls, meditation chambers, courtyards, and a tower that overlooks the mountain path below, all raised at an elevation where the air itself grows thin, and the cold alone is enough to kill an unprepared traveller within hours. Every stone of that monastery had to be quarried, carried, or shaped at an altitude that made ordinary labour exhausting even for hardened Nords. And it stands to reason that this labour was itself treated as part of the discipline Jurgen was trying to instill in his new followers, a physical trial matched to the spiritual one they had already undergone in accepting his philosophy. The choice to build somewhere so deliberately difficult to reach was never accidental. A monastery built in a valley or along a well-travelled road would have invited exactly the kind of casual visitation and worldly entanglement that the way of the voice was designed to move away from. The isolation of the throat of the world was not an unfortunate side effect of the location. It was the entire point, a physical barrier matching the spiritual one Jurgen had already begun to erect between his order and the ambitions of the world below. It is worth pausing here to consider what kind of daily existence this demanded from the earliest members of the order, an existence that continues, essentially unchanged, among the small number of Greybeards who remain by the time of the Fourth Era. To live surrounded by your closest companions, men you have trained beside and meditated alongside for years, and to know that a single unguarded word, spoken in frustration or joy or simple forgetfulness, could kill the person standing next to you, requires a level of constant, unwavering self-discipline that few human institutions in any era have ever demanded of their members. One interpretation of why the order remains so small throughout its history, consisting at any given time of only a small handful of members according to the law that survives, is precisely because so few people who showed talent for the voice could actually sustain this level of discipline across an entire lifetime. The Greybeards, even from their earliest founding under Jurgen Windcaller, were never meant to be a populous order. They were meant to be a vanishingly rare fellowship of individuals willing to give up almost everything, including the simple human comfort of ordinary conversation, in service of a philosophy that asked them to treat their own greatest strength as something almost too dangerous to use at all. The 7,000 steps and the etched tablets. For anyone who has ever made the long climb up from the village of Ivarsted toward the summit of the throat of the world, the journey itself functions as a kind of living scripture, a path deliberately designed to teach the entire history you have just heard, one carved tablet at a time. The path begins innocently enough, crossing the bridge on the northwest side of Ivarsted, where a man named Klimek can typically be found discussing the dangers that wait higher up the mountain, and where he sometimes asks travellers to carry supplies up to the Greybeards on his behalf, since he himself never makes the climb personally. From that bridge, The path winds upward through increasingly hostile terrain, home to frost trolls, ice wraiths, and the occasional wandering dragon, a physical difficulty that mirrors, quite deliberately, the spiritual difficulty the pilgrimage is meant to represent. This is not a gentle walk. It is meant to test the traveller, to strip away comfort and complacency with every laboured step upward into thinner and colder air. Scattered along this ascent are 10 stone tablets, referred to in Greybeard tradition as emblems, each one etched with a short verse that, taken together, tells the complete history of the voice from the age of dragon dominion through to the founding of High Hrothgar itself. Reading through these 10 emblems in sequence is, in a very real sense, reading a condensed version of everything we have already covered in this story, except carved permanently into stone by hands that wanted this history to survive as long as the mountain itself. The first tablet begins at the very beginning, describing how before the birth of men, the dragons ruled all of Mundus, their word the voice, spoken only for what the tradition calls true needs, a word that could blot out the sky and flood the land entirely. The second continues the story forward, describing how men were born and spread across Mundus, while the dragons presided over what the carving bluntly calls the crawling masses, men too weak in that era to possess any voice of their own. The third emblem describes the fledgling defiance of early humanity, unafraid to war against the dragons and their voices despite having no real power to answer with, only to be shouted down and have their hearts broken, an image that captures the raw hopelessness of that early struggle. The fourth tablet marks the turning point of the entire history, describing how Cain called upon Paarthurnax, who pitied mankind, and how together they taught men to use the voice, at which point the dragon war began in earnest, dragon against tongue for the first time in the history of the world. The fifth continues into the resolution of that war, describing how man ultimately prevailed, shouting Alduin out of the world, while acknowledging plainly that the sacrifices required to achieve that victory were many-fold. A quiet but unmistakable reference to the deaths of heroes like Gormleth Golden Hilt. The sixth tablet, continuing the sequence, moves the story forward through the centuries that followed, and by the seventh, the narrative arrives specifically at Jurgen Windcaller himself, describing how the tongues at Red Mountain went away humbled, and how Jurgen Windcaller began his 7-year meditation, specifically to understand how strong voices could fail, despite everything Nordic tradition had always assumed about their power. The eighth continues directly from there, recording how Jurgen chose silence and returned from his isolation, how the 17 disputants could not shout him down despite their combined effort, and how Jurgen the Calm built his home on the throat of the world, a direct stone reference to the very confrontation and founding we walked through in the previous section of this story. The ninth tablet leaps forward again, this time all the way to the Second Era, recording for future pilgrims that for years all silent, the Greybeards spoke one name, and that Tiber Septim, a stripling then, was summoned to Hrothgar, where they blessed and named him Dovahkiin, a moment we will explore in far greater detail shortly. The 10th and final tablet closes the sequence not with another piece of narrative history, but with a distillation of the entire philosophy itself into 3 short lines. The voice is worship. Follow the inner path. Speak only in true need. It is worth noticing what the stonecarvers chose to leave out of this sequence just as much as what they chose to include. Nowhere among the 10 tablets is there any mention of Ulfric Stormcloak's decade of training, nor any reference to the ongoing rivalry with the Blades, nor any accounting of the exact number of Greybeards presently living within High Hrothgar's walls at any given moment a pilgrim happens to pass by. The tablets were clearly never intended as a comprehensive record of everything the Order has experienced across its long history. They were built, instead, as a deliberately narrow funnel, guiding a climbing pilgrim's attention toward exactly three things and nothing more: the humbling truth about the limits of raw power, the specific example of one man who transformed that humbling into wisdom, and the philosophy that transformation eventually produced. One interpretation of this careful narrowing is that it mirrors, in miniature, the entire discipline the Greybeards ask of anyone who wishes to join them. Just as a Greybeard must eventually learn to speak only what is necessary and nothing more, the tablets themselves speak only what a pilgrim truly needs to understand before reaching the monastery doors. Trusting that the rest of the Order's history, its individual members, its quieter controversies, can be learned later, in person, once the pilgrim has already proven themselves willing to walk the whole difficult length of the path. The climb itself is rarely a solitary experience, and the travellers a pilgrim encounters along the way add their own quiet texture to the journey. Two figures in particular, a woman named Karita and a man named Barknar, can often be found somewhere along the ascent, each engaged in their own private act of devotion, whether kneeling before one of the etched tablets in silent contemplation, or simply sitting at the trail's edge, gathering the resolve needed to continue upward through the thinning air and the biting wind. Neither of them belongs to the Greybeards themselves, and neither seeks to join the Order permanently. They are simply pilgrims, ordinary Nords drawn by the same ancient belief that carried travellers up this mountain for thousands of years before High Hrothgar even existed, the belief that mankind itself was first breathed into being on this very peak by Kine. Encountering them partway up the trail lends the entire pilgrimage a sense of continuity, a reminder that the Dragonborn's own ascent is not a singular, extraordinary event, but one small repetition of a ritual that countless ordinary people have undertaken across the centuries, seeking nothing more than a closer connection to the sky their ancestors always understood as sacred ground. Klimek's role in this pilgrimage deserves a moment of its own attention, small as his part in the larger story might initially seem. He is a man who has apparently spent a considerable stretch of his life gathering supplies, food, ingredients, and small comforts meant for the Greybeards above, without ever once making the climb himself to deliver them directly. He explains this hesitation openly to travellers who ask, describing the mountain path as simply too dangerous for a man of his skills to risk alone, and he is candid about relying instead on passing adventurers willing to carry his bundle upward in exchange for a small reward. There is something quietly moving in this arrangement once you sit with it. Klimek has devoted years to sustaining an order he will likely never meet in person, gathering goods for men whose faces he does not know and whose voices he will never hear, motivated by nothing more than the simple conviction that the Greybeards deserve support from the town closest to their door. It stands to reason that Klimek represents, in his own modest and entirely mortal way, exactly the kind of quiet devotion the way of the voice ultimately hopes to inspire in those who cannot themselves master the Thu'um. A reminder that reverence for the order atop the mountain is not restricted only to those capable of climbing it. There is something profoundly intentional about structuring the pilgrimage this way, ending not on another historical event, but on pure philosophical instruction, as though the entire climb has been building toward a final moment where the pilgrim is asked to internalize not just what happened, but what it means for how they themselves ought to live. Any traveller who takes the time to stop and read all 10 of these tablets in full is granted, according to long tradition preserved in the game itself, a blessing known as the voice of the sky, an effect that causes wildlife along the mountain to neither flee from nor attack the traveller for a full day. A small but meaningful sign that the mountain itself, or perhaps the divine wind Cain once breathed across its peak, recognizes and rewards genuine engagement with the history and philosophy the tablets contain. It is worth noting, based on what we know from those who have carefully counted the visible steps along this path, that the literal number of steps does not actually reach 7,000, closer in physical reality to somewhere between 700 and 800, a discrepancy that has become something of a beloved curiosity among those who study the game closely. But this discrepancy feels, in its own way, entirely appropriate to the spirit of the pilgrimage. The number 7,000 was never truly about a literal count of stone steps. It was always about the sense of an arduous, seemingly endless spiritual journey, one long enough and hard enough that by the time a traveller reaches the doors of High Hrothgar, they have earned, through sheer physical and mental endurance, at least the smallest fragment of understanding regarding what it means to walk the inner path the 10th tablet speaks of. The silence and the cost of the way. To truly understand what the Greybeards ask of the men and women who join their order, it helps to imagine, in specific and concrete terms, what an ordinary day actually looks like inside the walls of High Hrothgar. The daily rhythms of individual Greybeards, preserved in detail through observation of their routines within the monastery, reveal an existence built almost entirely around repetition, discipline, and an almost total absence of the small comforts most people take for granted. Consider Arngeir, the most senior and most capable speaker among the Greybeards by the time of the 4th era. His days begin extraordinarily early, waking at 2:30 in the morning to begin meditating at every window along the western hall of the monastery, moving methodically from one to the next, as though each window offers some slightly different angle on the sky he has devoted his entire existence to attuning himself toward. By 4 in the morning, he moves outward into the courtyard, meditating either beside the fire or at the center of the open grounds, sometimes practicing shouts in various locations around the exterior of the monastery. From 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, an extraordinary 8-hour stretch, he meditates within the main hall itself, before returning to the windows of the eastern and western halls for further contemplation, eventually retiring to bed at 10 at night in whichever bed happens to be available. Notably absent from this entire routine is any mention of meals. Arngeir, according to the detailed record of his habits, does not eat, sustaining himself through a discipline so total that even the basic biological need for food has apparently been set aside, or transcended, in service of his devotion. Bori, one of the other Greybeard elders who shares the monastery with Arngeir, follows a similarly regimented schedule, rising at 4 in the morning to meditate facing the windows on prayer mats, rotating to a different window each hour with mechanical precision, before moving to the courtyard at noon, then to the tower above the courtyard, where he occasionally practices the clear skies shout against the open sky, then to the shrine in the main entry hall by 4:30, and finally back to the main hall itself by 8 in the evening, where he continues rotating his position in a slow clockwise pattern through the remainder of the night. There is something almost hypnotic in reading through these schedules, a sense of lives lived entirely outside the normal rhythms of human society, structured instead around an unbroken cycle of contemplation that repeats, essentially unchanged, day after day, year after year, decade after decade. It stands to reason that a life this rigorously structured would eventually reshape a person almost entirely, stripping away whatever personality or individual desires they once carried and replacing them with something closer to living scripture. A person who has become, through sheer repetition, an embodiment of the philosophy they practice, rather than simply a believer in it. This raises a natural question worth sitting with, namely, how the Greybeards ever managed to accept new students into an order this demanding without risking real harm to the very people they are trying to teach. The evidence suggests that the answer lies in a carefully staged process of gradual exposure, in which a new arrival is never handed the full weight of an advanced practitioner's voice all at once, but is instead walked step by step through increasingly difficult words of power, each one tested first in a controlled setting, before the student is trusted to use it more broadly. This is precisely the pattern the last Dragonborn experiences firsthand, absorbing individual words directly from the floor where an elder has projected them, practicing each new fragment of a shout against harmless ethereal targets, summoned specifically for that purpose, rather than against any living being who might actually be endangered by a mistake. It stands to reason that this careful staging is itself a product of centuries of accumulated caution. The Greybeards, having learned, likely through hard and possibly tragic experience somewhere in their long history, exactly how much power a beginner can safely be trusted with at each stage of their training. Even so, the Order has never claimed that everyone who shows a talent for the voice can ultimately succeed within their walls. The Greybeards are, by their own account, willing to accept almost anyone who demonstrates genuine aptitude, but they are equally candid about the reality that few can actually sustain the demands of the lifestyle that aptitude ultimately requires. Even the physical space the Greybeards inhabit seems shaped around this same philosophy of restraint and repetition. Throughout the interior halls of High Hrothgar hang a number of large woven banners, and a careful traveller who studies them closely will notice that despite how many of them are displayed throughout the monastery, there are really only two distinct phrases repeated across the whole collection, arranged in pairs, as though each banner were meant to be read alongside its partner rather than in isolation. There is something fitting in this minimalism, a visual echo of the same discipline that governs everything else about how the Greybeards live. A wealthier or more worldly institution might have commissioned dozens of unique tapestries celebrating different moments of its history, different heroes, different victories. The Greybeards, true to the philosophy Jurgen Windcaller first articulated, chose instead to surround themselves with only the barest necessary repetition of their central creed, the same handful of words returned to again and again, rather than endlessly multiplied, exactly the way their own spoken vocabulary narrows down, through decades of discipline, to only what genuinely needs to be said. The cost of this life extends well beyond the loss of ordinary comforts like food or unstructured time. Perhaps the most profound sacrifice the Greybeards make, and the one most central to understanding why their order remains so small, involves the near total loss of ordinary spoken communication with the people around them. As their mastery of the Thu'um deepens over years of disciplined practice, the destructive potential contained within an unguarded sentence grows correspondingly greater, until eventually, for the most senior and accomplished Greybeards, even a whisper carries enough raw force to be lethal to anyone standing nearby who lacks specific training to withstand it. This is not exaggeration or metaphor. It is treated within the tradition itself as simple and dangerous physical fact. Among the Greybeards, who remain by the time of the Fourth Era, only Arngeir possesses sufficient control and mastery to speak safely to outsiders at any length, a distinction explained plainly to visitors who ask why the other elders never seem to engage in ordinary conversation. Their voices, quite simply, are too powerful for anyone not trained in the way to withstand, meaning that Einarth, Bori and Wulfgar, despite living together within the same walls for years, are functionally cut off from verbal communication with virtually everyone outside their own order, reduced to communicating with visitors through nothing more than a respectful, wordless bow and a soft, rumbling acknowledgement. Imagine for a moment what that isolation actually feels like from the inside, day after day, year after year. To have devoted your entire life to mastering a form of expression, the voice itself, only to discover that your mastery has made ordinary conversation with almost everyone around you not simply difficult, but genuinely dangerous. This could imply that the deepest and most painful sacrifice the way of the voice demands is not physical hardship or the loss of comfort, difficult as those certainly are, but something closer to a profound and permanent loneliness, a state in which the very thing that makes you powerful simultaneously makes you unreachable. Even communication between the Greybeards themselves must be carefully modulated, conducted at whispers and murmurs pitched specifically to avoid harming one another despite their shared training. A life lived in perpetual, careful quiet, even among one's closest companions and fellow devotees. When the tradition speaks of the way of the voice being neither wide nor easy, a phrase attributed directly to Jurgen Windcaller himself in the words he is remembered speaking in Sovngarde, it is this totality of sacrifice the phrase is describing. Not simply physical austerity, though that is certainly part of it, but a complete and lifelong surrender of the ordinary human comfort of being heard and being able to speak freely by the very people closest to you. Sitting alongside this sacrifice is a single phrase that governs the outer limit of everything a Greybeard is permitted to do with the power they have spent their whole life restraining. The concept the tradition simply calls true need. It is worth being precise about what this actually means, because it is easy to misread the Greybeards as strict pacifists who reject violence under any circumstance whatsoever, and that reading is not quite accurate. The way of the voice does not forbid violence outright. It teaches instead that violence represents the least worthy use of the voice, a tool to be reached for only when every other option has genuinely been exhausted, and even then wielded with obvious reluctance rather than pride. This distinction carries real weight in how the order actually behaves when tested. Should a dragon threaten High Hrothgar directly, the Greybeards do not hesitate, and their silence does not extend to refusing self-defense or the defense of the mountain they have guarded for millennia. What the concept of true need forbids is not force itself, but the casual, habitual reach for force that once defined the tongues before Jurgen's meditation. The assumption that because a man possesses a powerful voice, he is therefore entitled to use it whenever convenience or ambition suggests he might. One interpretation of why the Greybeards extend a specific and pointed exception to the Dragonborn, permitting a level of violence in their student that they would never sanction in themselves, is that they recognize the peculiar and singular nature of the Dragonborn's role in the world, understanding that a being tasked with facing down dragons, and eventually Alduin himself, cannot reasonably be held to the same standard of restraint that governs an ordinary tongue living out a quiet life of contemplation on a mountaintop. True need, in other words, is not a fixed rule applied identically to everyone who studies the voice. It is a judgment weighed carefully against circumstance, and the Greybeards seem to understand, even within their own rigid philosophy, that circumstance is rarely as simple as a single carved rule could ever fully capture. Tiber Septim and the Age of Legends. For centuries after the founding of High Hrothgar, the Greybeards maintained an existence of near total silence toward the outside world, so thoroughly withdrawn from the affairs of Skyrim and the broader continent that long stretches of their history simply pass without record, the order existing in the background of Nordic civilization like a held breath, present but essentially unheard from. This silence, however, was occasionally broken, and each time it was, the event was significant enough to reshape the course of history far beyond the walls of the monastery itself. The tradition holds that the combined voice of all the Greybeards speaking together is a thing of genuine legend, powerful enough, according to one account, to have blasted the legendary hero king Ulfric into nothing but ash during one particular confrontation, an act that speaks to just how carefully the Order guarded the moments in which they chose to break their silence. Before Tiber Septim ever climbed the mountain himself, the title he would eventually claim already carried enormous weight within Nordic legend. Weight that stretched back to an even earlier hero king remembered as Ulfric, sometimes called Ysmir, the Dragon of the North. Ulfric's own relationship with the voice and with the divine forces surrounding Skyrim was the stuff of already ancient legend by the time Tiber Septim was born, involving struggles against gods and ghosts that blurred the line between history and myth so thoroughly that later scholars have never fully untangled fact from embellishment. What matters for this story is that the title Ysmir, Dragon of the North, was understood among the Nords to be exceptionally rare, bestowed across the entirety of recorded history upon only a small handful of individuals ever considered worthy of carrying it. The Tiber Septim would eventually be counted among that select company, alongside Ulfric, and, many centuries later, the last Dragonborn, speaks to just how seriously the Greybeards themselves understood the weight of what they were about to bestow when they finally chose to break their silence once more. The most consequential of these rare moments occurred during the Second Era, when the Greybeards, after what the record describes as years of unbroken silence, finally spoke a single name into the world once more. That name belonged to a young, and at that time entirely unremarkable man, who would eventually become known to history as Tiber Septim, the founder of the Septim dynasty, and the first emperor to ever unite the whole of Tamriel under a single banner. Before he carried any of those titles, before he was anything more than a stripling, to use the exact word the stone tablets themselves employ, he was summoned to High Hrothgar by the Greybeards, who recognized in him something the rest of the world had not yet noticed. According to one legend preserved alongside this history, the summons came at a particularly dramatic moment, arriving just as the young Tiber Septim led an invasion of the settlement of Old Hroldan, using the power of his own voice for the very first time as he moved to conquer the town from the Reach folk who held it. It was in that exact moment, far away atop their mountain, that the Greybeards prepared to speak, and storms began brewing above High Hrothgar as they summoned him to their halls. When Tiber Septim finally arrived and completed whatever trials the Greybeards required of him, they formally blessed him and named him Dovahkiin, Dragonborn, publicly acknowledging for the first time in centuries that the ancient blood and gift of the dragons had appeared again in a mortal man. It was during this same period at High Hrothgar, based on what we know from the surviving accounts, that Tiber Septim also learned of his broader destiny, understanding for the first time that he was meant to become far more than a regional conqueror, that his path led toward the unification of the entire continent under a single crown. This detail carries enormous weight when placed alongside the later disputes between the Greybeards and the Blades, disputes we will examine closely toward the end of this story, because the Blades would eventually claim that Tiber Septim's entire imperial destiny was achieved in spite of the Greybeards rather than because of them. And yet the historical record is fairly clear on this point. It was the Greybeards who first recognized Tiber Septim's nature, who summoned him, who blessed him, and who first told him of the destiny that would eventually reshape the map of the world entirely. One interpretation of Tiber Septim's later relationship to the order that first named him holds particular significance for understanding the deep and ancient roots of the conflict between the Greybeards and the Blades. Even after Tiber Septim rose to become emperor and founded the line of Dragonborn rulers that would follow him, he is remembered as having protected Paarthurnax from the Blades' desire to see the ancient dragon destroyed, a protection that persisted through the entire line of Dragonborn emperors who descended from him. This suggests, based on what the evidence allows us to piece together, that Tiber Septim's own encounter with the Greybeards left him with a genuine respect for the order and its philosophy, one that extended even to a willingness to shield their reclusive Grandmaster from the vengeance the Blades had wanted to exact against him since the earliest days of their own founding as the Akaviri Dragon Guard. There is a particular kind of quiet vindication in this detail, a suggestion that the man history remembers as one of Tamriel's greatest conquerors and unifiers may have carried throughout the whole of his reign, a debt of gratitude toward the silent order that first recognized what he was and who ultimately used the power of his crown to protect that order's most vulnerable and most controversial member from those who would have destroyed him. After the ceremony that named Tiber Septim as Dovahkiin, the Greybeards withdrew once again into their customary silence, and by the time centuries had passed and the world arrived at the events of the Fourth Era, their numbers had dwindled considerably from whatever strength the Order may once have held. The record indicates that by this later period, the Greybeards had shrunk to only 5 members total, 4 dwelling within the physical walls of High Hrothgar itself, and their Grandmaster residing higher still, in permanent solitary meditation at the inaccessible summit above them. This dwindling matters enormously for understanding the emotional weight carried by every subsequent event in this story, because it means that by the time the last Dragonborn eventually climbs the 7,000 steps, they are not simply meeting a thriving religious order at the height of its influence. They are meeting the last handful of survivors of a tradition that has been slowly fading for thousands of years, a fellowship so reduced in number that the arrival of even a single new and worthy student represents an event of genuine historical significance, the kind of significance that had not occurred, according to their own accounting, in well over a century. Ulfric Stormcloak's failed path. Not every student who climbed the 7,000 steps and sought instruction from the Greybeards proved capable of sustaining the demands of the life they were asking to join, and no example of this illustrates the tension inherent in the way of the voice more clearly than the story of a young man who would eventually become known throughout Skyrim as Ulfric Stormcloak, the future Jarl of Windhelm and the leader of the rebellion that bears his name. Long before Ulfric ever raised a banner against the Empire or duelled a High King to death in the streets of Solitude, he was a student at High Hrothgar, accepted into training by the Greybeards, from what accounts suggest was quite a young age, spending roughly a decade of his life immersed in the discipline and philosophy that Jurgen Windcaller first articulated so many centuries earlier. This detail deserves particular attention because it directly explains a mystery that many who encounter Ulfric Stormcloak in his later life find puzzling. Ulfric is capable of using the Thuum in actual combat, a rare and formidable ability, and this capacity traces directly back to his years of Greybeard instruction, providing him with genuine skill in the voice, even though, by the time we meet him as an adult, he has clearly abandoned the philosophy that originally taught him how to wield it. One interpretation worth sitting with is that Ulfric's training gave him real and lasting power, but never gave him, or perhaps was never able to give him, the deeper internal discipline. The way of the voice actually demands alongside that power. He learned the mechanics of the Thuum thoroughly enough to eventually use it as a weapon of devastating consequence. But the philosophical core of restraint that Jurgen Windcaller discovered atop this very same mountain never fully took root within him, or was ultimately set aside when circumstances demanded, in his own judgment, a different kind of response. The circumstances that pulled Ulfric away from High Hrothgar arrived in the form of the Great War, the brutal and ultimately humiliating conflict between the Empire and the Aldmeri Dominion that reshaped the political landscape of the entire continent. When war broke out, Ulfric felt, according to the tradition that surrounds his story, a duty-bound obligation to leave his training behind and join the fighting as an Imperial Legionnaire, abandoning the isolated pacifist life of the Greybeards in favor of direct martial service to his homeland in its moment of crisis. This choice led him into Thalmor captivity, where he was interrogated at length by Aldmeri agents, and based on how his later life unfolds, it seems reasonable to assume this experience played some role in hardening the fierce, uncompromising nationalism that comes to define the rest of his political career and his eventual rebellion against imperial rule. It stands to reason, following that same thread, that this period of captivity and suffering hardened whatever remained of his Greybeard training into something considerably more brittle and more willing to justify violence as necessary. A philosophical drift away from Jurgen Windcaller's careful teachings about true need and toward a much more expansive and personally determined understanding of when force becomes justified. The rupture between Ulfric and the order that trained him became permanent and unmistakable during the events surrounding what history remembers as the Markarth incident, and it was cemented completely by his later duel against High King Torrig, a confrontation in which Ulfric used the full and devastating force of his Thuum to kill the High King in what Nordic tradition recognizes as an ancient and legitimate form of ceremonial combat, though the Empire views the same act as nothing less than murder and treason. This single act, whatever one's opinion of its legality or morality, represents the complete and unmistakable inversion of everything the way of the voice was originally created to prevent. Jurgen Windcaller devoted 7 years of meditation specifically to understanding how the arrogant, martial use of the voice had led the ancient Nords to catastrophic defeat, and had built an entire philosophy around the principle that violence should be reserved only for moments of absolute true need. Ulfric, trained for a decade in that exact philosophy, chose instead to use his voice to kill a political rival in a duel whose entire purpose was to settle a succession dispute through Nordic tradition rather than through the kind of restraint his Greybeard teachers had spent their whole lives trying to instill within him. This lingering complexity in Ulfric's feelings toward his former teachers surfaces again during the events of Season Unending, the negotiation that brings representatives of both the Stormcloak rebellion and the Empire to High Hrothgar itself, to broker a temporary ceasefire in the name of confronting the greater threat of Alduin's return. During these negotiations, both Ulfric Stormcloak and his loyal second-in-command, Galmar Stonefist, have additional dialogue specifically addressing the Greybeards and the setting they find themselves standing within. Conversation that reveals a mixture of grudging respect and old, unresolved tension as two hardened rebels find themselves once again standing beneath the roof of the order that shaped Ulfric's earliest understanding of his own power. It is a strange kind of homecoming for him, forced by circumstance rather than chosen freely, and it stands to reason that walking back into those silent halls, this time as a war leader negotiating with his political enemies, rather than as a young student seeking wisdom, must have carried its own particular weight for a man who once spent a full decade of his life within those exact walls. Learning a philosophy of restraint he would eventually set aside in pursuit of a cause he believed mattered more. It is worth knowing that Ulfric was not the first student the Greybeards ever accepted, who ultimately proved unable to complete the path they had set out for him. Nordic tradition remembers another figure from centuries earlier, a Dragon Guard member named Grundwulf, spoken of in the same breath as Ulfric, whenever the Order's history is summarized as an account of both remarkable successes and quiet failures. Little detail survives about Grundwulf's specific circumstances, far less than survives about Ulfric's own well-documented life, but the mere fact that his name endures at all, remembered specifically as someone who either failed to fully develop his mastery of the voice or failed to sustain the ascetic demands of the lifestyle required to wield it safely, tells us something important about how the Greybeards themselves seem to regard their own history. They do not appear to have edited their failures out of memory the way a more image-conscious institution might. One interpretation of this willingness to remember Grundwulf alongside Ulfric is that the Greybeards understand, perhaps better than any other order in Skyrim's history, that the difficulty of the way of the voice is not a flaw to be hidden, but a truth to be honestly acknowledged, proof that the philosophy Jurgen Windcaller built was never meant to be easy, and that its rare successes carry weight precisely because so many capable and well-intentioned students across so many centuries have ultimately found the path too demanding to walk to its end. What makes this story genuinely tragic, rather than simply a straightforward tale of a bad student failing his teachers, is the evidence suggesting that Ulfric never fully abandoned respect for the way of the voice, even after everything that followed. According to his own later reflections, shared in conversation with the last Dragonborn, Ulfric mentions that he still does not take the Thu'um lightly, even though he acknowledges he was ultimately unable to fully embrace its underlying philosophy of restraint. This suggests a man who understood, even as he chose the path of rebellion and political violence, exactly what he was walking away from, and carried that awareness with him, rather than simply dismissing his greybeard training as an irrelevant chapter of his youth. Perhaps most striking of all is a detail the Greybeards themselves never directly address. Despite Ulfric having trained under their instruction for a full decade, and despite his later actions becoming central to one of the defining political conflicts of the entire Fourth Era, the Greybeards make almost no reference to him whatsoever throughout the events of the main questline, save for a single moment during the negotiations of a temporary ceasefire. One interpretation of this near-total silence is that it represents its own kind of statement, a quiet acknowledgement from the Order that Ulfric Stormcloak's path however skilled he became with the voice they taught him, ultimately led somewhere the way was never meant to go, and that some failures are simply too painful or too complicated to discuss even among masters who have spent their entire lives learning to speak only when speech is truly necessary. The Greybeards of High Hrothgar today. By the time the last Dragonborn first climbs the 7,000 steps in the year 4 E201, the order that Jurgen Windcaller founded so many centuries earlier has been reduced to just 5 remaining members, and understanding each of them individually reveals just how much personality and quiet history can exist within lives defined almost entirely by silence and discipline. Foremost among them is Arngeir, whose extensive training and advanced age have granted him a level of control over his own Thu'um, sufficient to allow him to speak freely with outsiders without endangering them, a distinction that makes him the effective voice and representative of the entire order in all dealings with the world beyond High Hrothgar's walls. Arngeir serves as what the tradition describes as the right hand of Paarthurnax, the Grandmaster who dwells above, and it falls to him to personally guard the throat of the world with what can only be described as genuine zeal, a devotion that comes through clearly in every interaction he has with visitors and pilgrims who arrive seeking the Order's wisdom. When the last Dragonborn first proves their nature by unconsciously demonstrating the power of unrelenting force, it is Arngeir who steps forward to formally begin their instruction, walking them carefully through the underlying mechanics of the Thu'um in a way that reveals just how deeply he understands the philosophy his order was built upon. He explains, in the patient and deliberate manner that defines all of his interactions, that the voice was originally a gift from the goddess Kinnereth, given to mortals at the very dawn of time, allowing them to speak as dragons themselves once spoke. He is careful to acknowledge, with a kind of weary honesty that speaks to centuries of accumulated disappointment, that this gift has often been misused throughout history, and that the only truly proper use of the voice remains, as Jurgen Windcaller first taught, the worship and glory of the gods rather than personal ambition or martial conquest. Arngeir also explains something crucial about the deeper spiritual purpose behind the Order's constant meditation, describing how true mastery of the voice can only be achieved when a practitioner's inner spirit is brought into complete harmony with their outward actions, a balance the Greybeards pursue continuously through their contemplation of the sky, which remains Kinnereth's sacred domain. Living alongside Arngeir within the walls of High Hrothgar are 3 additional elders, Bori, Ulfgar, and Einarth, each of whom carries the full weight of mastery over the Thu'um, without possessing Arngeir's rare capacity to speak safely with outsiders. Einarth, based on what can be observed of his personal effects and habits, appears to carry particular scholarly interests alongside his spiritual discipline, keeping among his few possessions a copy of a text on Dwemer history and culture, suggesting a mind that remains curious about the wider world and its deeper mysteries, even after a lifetime spent largely in silent contemplation. During one particularly significant moment, when Arngeir initially hesitates to help the Dragonborn locate the shout known as Dragonrend, it is Einarth who can be heard directly rebuking him in the dragon tongue, insisting that the Dragonborn deserves to speak with Paarthurnax and receive the guidance they need. This single moment reveals something important about the internal dynamics among the Greybeards that their outward uniformity of silence tends to obscure. Even among an order built around restraint and careful deliberation, individual elders clearly hold and are willing to express their own convictions, even if that expression must occur in the dragon tongue rather than in ordinary speech, precisely because ordinary speech from Einarth would be too dangerous for anyone nearby to safely hear. Wulfgar, the second of the three silent elders, is remembered for his role in personally teaching the Dragonborn the shout known as Whirlwind Sprint, demonstrating the technique himself by shouting the first word and leaping through a narrow opening in the courtyard gate with what onlookers describe as genuinely inhuman speed. There is something worth pausing on in the simple, practical honesty of this teaching method. Rather than merely explaining the theory of the shout in whatever limited way silence might allow, Wulfgar simply performs it, trusting the demonstration itself to communicate what words could not safely convey. Bori, the final of the three silent elders, carries among his own few possessions a flute and, notably, an amulet of Talos, a small but meaningful detail given the immense political and religious controversy surrounding Talos worship throughout the rest of Skyrim during this exact period of the Fourth Era. It stands to reason that even here, isolated at the very summit of the world and largely disconnected from the politics unfolding in the lowlands below, the Greybeards have not entirely escaped the currents of belief and devotion that continue to shape the rest of Nordic society, a small human detail tucked quietly into the pocket of an otherwise almost impossibly disciplined and ascetic life. Even the Greybeards' relationship to violence itself, something their entire philosophy is built around minimizing, reveals interesting texture upon closer study. Despite their profound commitment to pacifism as a guiding principle, all four elders remain fully capable combatants when circumstances genuinely demand it, retaining mastery over shouts such as disarm, dismay, elemental fury, fire breath, frost breath, and ice form, alongside the more famous unrelenting force and whirlwind sprint that form the core of their teaching curriculum. Should a dragon stray too near High Hrothgar, while any of the elders happen to be outside its walls, they will not hesitate to engage the threat directly, and should one Greybeard find themselves under attack, the others will emerge without delay to join the fight alongside their companion. This willingness to fight, held in careful balance against their overwhelming preference for silence and restraint, illustrates precisely the nuance Jurgen Windcaller's original philosophy always contained, the understanding that violence remains permissible in moments of true need, even for those who have devoted their entire lives to avoiding it. None of the four elders can be permanently killed through ordinary means, a detail that speaks less to any particular narrative device and more to the sheer accumulated mastery each of them has achieved after a lifetime, or in some cases, many lifetimes, of disciplined practice. Struck down in combat, a Greybeard will simply kneel, allow their strength to slowly return, and rise again to continue the fight, an image that feels entirely appropriate for men who have spent decades training their bodies and minds to endure far greater trials than any single physical confrontation could ever present. It is worth lingering a moment longer on Wulfgar specifically, because the handful of personal possessions he carries reveal a surprisingly ordinary domestic life, tucked inside an otherwise extraordinary existence. Alongside his robes, he keeps a wooden bowl, a simple knife and fork, a quill and a roll of paper, and a small collection of food, a nirnroot, a potato, a cut of venison, a jar of honey, a wedge of goat cheese, and a piece of bread. None of these items carry any obvious ceremonial or magical significance. They are, quite simply, the belongings of a man who still eats, still writes, and still keeps a modest and orderly set of possessions despite having devoted the greater part of his life to a philosophy that asks him to want almost nothing at all. There is something quietly humanizing in this detail, a reminder that even the most disciplined ascetic still requires bread and a bowl to eat it from. That transcendence, however sincerely pursued, never fully erases the ordinary needs of the body it is housed within. Wulfgar's collection of small, unremarkable belongings sits in gentle contrast to Einarth's scholarly text on Dwemer history, and to Borri's flute and amulet, together painting a picture of four men who, whatever else they have surrendered to the way, have each still managed to hold on to some small private fragment of an individual life. What becomes clear, spending time with all four of these elders across the course of the Dragonborn's training, is that the Greybeards are not, despite their reputation and their outward silence, an order defined purely by passive withdrawal from the world. Each of them, according to their own daily routines, maintains an unbroken and physically demanding schedule of meditation, prayer, and shout practice that continues around the clock, structured with the same rigor a soldier might apply to military drilling, except aimed entirely inward rather than outward. Their silence is not laziness or simple withdrawal. It is, in every observable sense, one of the most demanding spiritual disciplines imaginable, sustained continuously by men who have collectively devoted many hundreds of years combined to a single unbroken philosophical tradition, waiting, largely without complaint, for a student capable of carrying that tradition forward into whatever centuries lie ahead of them. Paarthurnax, the Grandmaster above even Arngir, above the entire visible hierarchy of Greybeards that a newly arrived pilgrim first encounters within the walls of High Hrothgar, resides the true Grandmaster of the Order, a figure whose identity remains hidden from outsiders for a substantial portion of the main quest line, precisely because revealing it too early would fundamentally alter how visitors understand everything else the Greybeards represent. That Grandmaster is Paarthurnax himself, the same dragon who, in the earliest chapter of this story, first rebelled against his own kind and taught the voice to mankind during the Dragon War. His name, translated from the dragon tongue, means ambition, overlord, cruelty, and it is by his fellow dragons, the younger brood, who share his ancient bloodline, that he is still referred to respectfully, and perhaps warily, as the Old One. Understanding Paarthurnax requires holding two seemingly contradictory truths simultaneously, and this tension sits at the very center of everything he represents to both the Greybeards who follow him and the visitors who eventually learn his true nature. During the Age of Dragon Dominion, before his rebellion, Paarthurnax served as lieutenant to his own older brother Alduin, and in that role, he is remembered as having committed, or at minimum witnessed and participated in, genuine atrocities against early mankind, cruelties severe enough that they remain a matter of bitter historical record, thousands of years later. This is not a detail the Greybeards attempt to hide or soften when the truth eventually comes to light. Paarthurnax himself does not deny this history when confronted with it directly. And yet it was this same Paarthurnax who ultimately chose rebellion, who taught the very Thuum that ended dragon dominion over mortals, and who has spent every single day since that rebellion, across a span of literal thousands of years, attempting to overcome what the tradition describes as his own persistent draconic instinct toward conquest and domination through nothing but the sheer disciplined power of meditation and will. One interpretation of Paarthurnax's motivation for turning against Alduin holds that it grew from Alduin's false claim to a kind of godhood, a claim to lordship that Paarthurnax personally found intolerable, perhaps because it represented an arrogance not unlike the very arrogance that would later doom the Nordic tongues at Red Mountain. Nordic religious tradition offers a somewhat different account, holding instead that it was Kain who intervened directly, calling upon Paarthurnax specifically because she pitied mankind and needed a dragon willing to defy his own kind on their behalf. The evidence available to us does not definitively resolve which account represents the fuller truth, and it stands to reason that both explanations may simply be describing the same underlying event from different angles, external divine intervention working alongside an internal moral awakening that was perhaps already stirring within Paarthurnax before Kain ever called upon him at all. What is beyond dispute is the length and totality of the vigil Paarthurnax has maintained since that rebellion concluded. After the ancient Nords used Dragonren and an Elder Scroll to hurl Alduin forward through time at the climax of the Dragon War, Paarthurnax took up permanent residence at the very summit of the throat of the world, precisely at the site of the time wound that Alduin's banishment had torn into reality, and he simply waited there, alone, for thousands upon thousands of mortal years, never knowing precisely when his brother might reappear, only that the moment would eventually come. During this impossibly long vigil, Paarthurnax became, through processes the lore never fully explains, the leader of the Greybeards, the Grandmaster whose wisdom and guidance shapes the entire philosophy of the Order, even though he lives physically separated from the human elders below him, accessible to visitors only once they have proven, through their own mastery of the voice, that they are capable of dispersing the powerful wind barrier that guards the path to his solitary peak. Even Paarthurnax's physical form bears the visible weight of the millennia he has spent atop that mountain, a detail worth dwelling on given that dragons are understood, throughout the whole of Nordic and broader Tamrielic tradition, to be functionally immortal beings whose bodies do not age or decay the way mortal flesh does, and yet Paarthurnax shows unmistakable signs of profound age regardless, his wings and tail marked by tattered, weathered skin, his horns and chin spikes broken and chipped in places, the color of his scales and eyes visibly dulled compared to the vibrancy typically associated with younger dragons, and several of his teeth missing entirely from a jaw that has, by any reasonable accounting, existed for longer than recorded Nordic history itself. One interpretation of this visible deterioration, despite his supposed immortality, suggests that the sheer duration of his solitary vigil, and perhaps the psychological toll of thousands of years spent wrestling against his own draconic instincts through nothing but meditation and will, has left marks on him that ordinary dragon physiology was never meant to bear. It stands to reason that a being can be immortal in the sense of never dying of old age and still be worn down, slowly and irreversibly, by the accumulated weight of time itself, a fate that feels almost more poignant than simple death would, given how many centuries Paarthurnax has already endured and how many more he may yet be required to face. The relationship between Paarthurnax and the last Dragonborn, once it finally begins, reveals a being who speaks with genuine warmth and something approaching gentleness, a striking contrast to the atrocities attributed to his distant past. He had not personally trained another student in over a century by the time the last Dragonborn arrives, according to his own accounting, a detail that underscores once again just how rare and significant the emergence of a new Dragonborn actually is within the broader sweep of this history. Paarthurnax proves instrumental in guiding the Dragonborn through the process of learning Dragonren for themselves, revealing the full history of the Time Wound and the ancient battle that created it, and ultimately standing alongside the Dragonborn in direct combat against his own brother atop the very mountain he has guarded for millennia. When Alduin is finally driven back and banished to Sovngarde during that final confrontation, Paarthurnax is struck, quite visibly, with genuine grief rather than triumph, a reaction that speaks to the complicated and enduring nature of his feelings toward the sibling he ultimately had to help defeat a second time. In the aftermath, rather than resting or claiming any credit for his role in the victory, Paarthurnax speaks, instead of his intention to bring the way of the voice to the wider population of dragons now scattered across Tamriel following Alduin's resurrection efforts. A mission that suggests his devotion to Jurgen Windcaller's original philosophy extends even beyond humanity, toward the redemption, however uncertain, of his own kind. This final mission deserves particular attention because of just how difficult and uncertain a task it truly represents. Unlike the mortal students who climb the 7,000 steps by choice, drawn by curiosity or destiny toward a philosophy they at least have some willingness to consider, the dragons Paarthurnax now hopes to reach were raised entirely within the old order he himself once served and eventually abandoned, an order built on conquest and casual cruelty toward mortals rather than restraint. Many of these dragons show little interest in abandoning that inherited worldview, continuing to terrorize the skies of Skyrim with the same hunger for dominance that once defined the entire draconic species before Paarthurnax's rebellion. One interpretation of Paarthurnax's decision to pursue this mission regardless, knowing full well how unlikely success might be, is that it represents the truest possible expression of everything he has spent thousands of years learning about restraint and patience. He does not expect immediate results. He has never expected immediate results. Not in his vigil over the time wound, not in his centuries of quiet mentorship of the Greybeards below him, and not now, in this final and perhaps impossible attempt to extend the same philosophy to creatures who share his own blood, but none of his own hard-won wisdom. The last Dragonborn's trial and the war with the blades, the full weight of everything this story has covered, the ancient rebellion, Jurgen Windcaller's meditation, the silent discipline maintained across thousands of years, ultimately converges on a single individual arriving at Hrothgar sometime around the year 4 E201, summoned there by a shout so powerful it shakes the very foundations of Whiterun far below the mountain's peak. This summons occurs immediately after the newly emerged Dragonborn absorbs their very first dragon soul, an event the Greybeards apparently sense the instant it happens, regardless of distance, confirming through their own reaction just how deeply attuned they remain to the flow of the Thu'um throughout the whole of Skyrim, even after centuries of physical isolation. Making the climb up the 7,000 steps for the first time, past the 10 carved tablets recounting this entire history, the Dragonborn arrives at the doors of High Hrothgar to be addressed directly by Arngir, who steps forward to acknowledge that a Dragonborn appears, in his words, at this exact moment in the turning of an age. What follows is a careful and deliberate process of testing and instruction, beginning with Einarth teaching the Dragonborn the second word of unrelenting force, a word meaning balance in the dragon tongue, which the Dragonborn is then asked to practice against ethereal targets summoned specifically for this purpose by the combined effort of Borri, Einarth and Wulfgar together. Arngir watches this demonstration with evident and genuine surprise at how quickly the new student progresses, remarking on their swift learning before moving them outward into the courtyard for further training in Whirlwind Sprint, where Wulfgar first demonstrates the shout before Borri opens a heavy gate that the Dragonborn must then sprint through, using the same technique before it swings closed again. Only after successfully completing these trials does Arngir finally send the Dragonborn on what he frames as one final test of their nature, a journey to retrieve an ancient artifact known as the Horn of Jurgen Windcaller from the ruined barrow of Ustengrav, the very same site where Jurgen himself was eventually laid to rest after his long life of teaching and meditation concluded. This quest carries a weight beyond its surface function as a simple test of capability, because it requires the Dragonborn to travel to the literal burial place of the man whose 7 years of solitary meditation gave birth to everything the Greybeards have since become. Reaching the depths of Ustengrav, the Dragonborn discovers that Jurgen Windcaller's tomb itself is marked in the Daedric script with a single word, Windcaller. A quiet and permanent monument to the founder resting undisturbed at the heart of the very order his philosophy created. Upon completing this final trial and returning the horn to High Hrothgar, all 4 Greybeard elders gather together and speak to the Dragonborn simultaneously in the dragon tongue. A moment so significant and so rare that the ground itself trembles beneath the force of their combined voice, formally recognizing the Dragonborn's true nature and welcoming them fully into whatever guidance and instruction the Order still has to offer. The words spoken during that ceremony are worth understanding in full, because the exact phrasing the Greybeards choose reveals something about how they themselves understand the moment. Speaking together in the dragon tongue, they declare that long has the storm crown languished with no worthy brow to sit upon, and that by their breath they bestow it now, in the name of Kine, in the name of Shore, and in the name of Admora of old, before finally proclaiming the Dragonborn Ysmir, the dragon of the north, and asking them to hearken to it. There is real significance buried in that specific title, Ysmir, since the tradition holds that only 2 other figures in the whole of recorded history were ever crowned with that same name: the legendary hero King Wulfharth and, later, Tiber Septim himself. For the Greybeards to extend that title to the last Dragonborn is to place them quite deliberately in the exact same lineage as the 2 most consequential voice wielders the Order had ever previously recognized, a lineage that had not received a new member in many centuries. It stands to reason that this was never treated by the Greybeards as a routine formality. Every word of that ceremony was chosen to connect the newly recognized Dragonborn backward through the entire history this story has walked through, all the way to the founding of the Order itself. Not long after this formal welcome, High Hrothgar itself becomes host to a moment of history far removed from quiet contemplation, when the negotiations of Season Unending bring representatives of both the Stormcloak Rebellion and the Empire directly into the Greybeards' own halls to broker a temporary ceasefire in the face of Alduin's growing threat. It is worth appreciating just how significant a concession this represents from an Order that has spent thousands of years deliberately avoiding entanglement in Skyrim's political affairs, criticized more than once across their long history for exactly this kind of detachment. And yet, when the stakes rise high enough, when the threat facing the province is no longer merely political but existential, the Greybeards open their doors to generals and jarls and rebel leaders alike, allowing the very kind of worldly conflict Jurgen Windcaller's philosophy was built to transcend to unfold beneath their own roof. Espen, present at these negotiations as one of the last surviving blades, ultimately proves instrumental in calming the assembled factions when tempers flare, delivering a pointed speech reminding everyone gathered that they are allowing lesser conflicts to take priority over the far greater danger Alduin represents. A speech that succeeds in clearing the way for the truce to finally be signed. One interpretation of the Greybeards' willingness to host this fraught and openly hostile gathering is that it represents, in its own quiet way, a genuine act of true need. The Order recognizing that the survival of Skyrim itself now depended on a diplomacy they were uniquely positioned, by virtue of their neutrality and their sacred mountain, to make possible. It is only after this formal welcome, once the Dragonborn has proven themselves worthy through trial and sacrifice, in a manner not unlike the original 17 disciples who once tested Jurgen Windcaller himself, that the deeper and more troubling tensions surrounding the Order finally come into full view, specifically the ancient and bitter conflict between the Greybeards and an entirely separate order known as the Blades. This rivalry, we should understand clearly, did not begin with anything related to the Dragonborn's own arrival in Skyrim. It stretches back across many centuries to the earliest days when the Blades existed, not yet under that name, but as the Akaviri Dragon Guard, warriors who had originally invaded Tamriel searching specifically for dragons to slay, only to eventually swear loyalty to Raymond Cyrodiil and transform into the elite protectors of the Imperial throne. From the very beginning of their existence in Tamriel, the Dragon Guard maintained awareness of Paarthurnax's presence atop the throat of the world, and it stands to reason that their organizational policy of avoiding direct confrontation with the Greybeards did nothing to diminish their desire to eventually exact what they considered justice against a dragon they viewed as an unpunished war criminal, regardless of whatever rebellion he had staged against his own kind afterward. By the time the last Dragonborn becomes entangled in this ancient dispute, the Blades have been reduced, much like the Greybeards themselves, to only a small handful of surviving members, chief among them a woman named Delphine, who has spent years searching specifically for signs of a new Dragonborn's emergence, and an elderly scholar named Esbern, who joins her once located within the ruins of the Ratway beneath Riften. The place where Delphine and Esbern eventually re-establish their order carries its own weight of ancient history, one worth understanding before the deeper conflict with the Greybeards comes fully into view. Skyhaven Temple, hidden and long forgotten in the mountains of the Reach, was originally built by the Akaviri themselves during the earliest days of their presence in Tamriel, serving as an outpost during the initial Akaviri invasion before Raymond Cyrodiil's forces met them at Pale Pass. After that war concluded and the Akaviri swore their loyalty to Raymond, the temple was later visited by a later emperor of that same dynasty, remembered as Raymond II, who, standing before the assembled Dragon Guard, sealed its doors with a blood seal that would ensure only another Dragonborn could ever open them again. This detail is worth sitting with for a moment, because it means Skyhaven Temple was never simply a convenient ruin that Delphine happened to stumble upon. It was constructed and specifically sealed by the ancestors of her own order, centuries before her birth, with the stated intention that it would remain closed until a Dragonborn eventually arrived to reopen it, which could imply that the entire rediscovery of the Blade's ancient headquarters was closer to a fulfilled design than a lucky excavation. Delphine herself survived the near-total collapse of the Blades during the Great War through sheer resilience and considerable personal danger. Evading multiple assassination attempts by Thalmor agents determined to wipe out every remaining member of an order the Aldmeri Dominion considered a lingering threat to their control over Tamriel, in one instance managing to kill an entire assassination team sent specifically to end her life. Once these two Blades eventually discover the truth of Paarthurnax's identity as Master of the Greybeards, an ancient enemy their order has hunted since its earliest founding as Dragon Guard, they demand that the Dragonborn kill him as a condition of continued cooperation. Citing his participation in the atrocities of the Dragon War as sufficient justification regardless of the centuries of rebellion and quiet service that followed. Arngir, upon learning of this demand, responds with what can only be described as genuine fury, defending Paarthurnax passionately by explaining that all dragons were initially bound to Alduin's will during that early era that Paarthurnax could not simply choose otherwise at the outset, and that his eventual rebellion and the centuries of guidance he subsequently offered to both the Greybeards and to Tiber Septim's entire imperial line ought to weigh far more heavily than crimes committed under circumstances he did not fully choose for himself. Before that final choice between the Blades and the Greybeards ever arrives, the Dragonborn must first undertake a journey that draws every earlier thread of this story together into a single, direct experience of the ancient past itself, learning that Dragonren cannot simply be taught through ordinary instruction, since it was never handed down by dragons, but was instead born entirely from mortal hands during the desperate final hours of the Dragon War. Paarthurnax reveals that the only way to learn it now is to retrieve an Elder Scroll and use its bond with the Time Wound to witness the Shout's creation directly. This sends the Dragonborn deep into the ruins beneath the College of Winterhold and into the sprawling underground realm known as Blackreach, in search of the scroll itself, a journey that carries its own considerable danger entirely separate from anything the Greybeards or the Blades have asked of them. Once the Elder Scroll is finally recovered and carried back to the summit of the Throat of the World, activating it at the site of the Time Wound produces a vision unlike anything else in the entire main questline, pulling the Dragonborn directly into the memory of that ancient battle, allowing them to witness Gormleth Golden Hilt, Hakon One Eye, and Feldir the Old Fighting Alduin, exactly as this story described many chapters ago, right down to Gormleth's fall and Feldir's desperate activation of the very same Elder Scroll, now trembling in the Dragonborn's own hands. Standing inside that vision, watching history unfold rather than simply hearing it recounted on a stone tablet or in an elder's careful words, the Dragonborn learns Dragonrend in the same way the very first mortal tongues once did, not through patient instruction, but through the raw, desperate necessity of witnessing exactly what the voice can accomplish when wielded at the absolute limit of mortal courage. The choice this conflict ultimately places before the Dragonborn, whether to honor the Blades' demand for what they frame as long overdue justice, or to honor the Greybeards' plea for mercy toward a being who has spent thousands of years attempting genuine atonement, cannot be resolved through any simple appeal to right or wrong, and the game itself refuses to offer an easy answer either way. Should the Dragonborn choose to spare Paarthurnax, Arngeir's gratitude and trust deepen considerably, but the Blades will refuse all further cooperation, viewing the choice as a fundamental betrayal of an oath centuries in the making. Should the Dragonborn instead choose to kill him, the consequences prove immediate and severe. Arngeir's fury becomes uncontainable, and he will lecture the Dragonborn with open rage upon their return to High Hrothgar, going so far as to threaten violence if they do not leave immediately, retracting the Greybeards' hospitality entirely and refusing from that point forward to reveal the locations of any further words of power hidden throughout Skyrim. Based on what we know of how deeply this entire order's identity is rooted in restraint, in the careful and hard-won lesson Jurgen Windcaller first discovered atop this exact mountain so many centuries earlier, it stands to reason that watching a student they trained and welcomed choose violence against their own Grandmaster represents, for the surviving Greybeards, something close to watching their entire philosophy fail all over again. The same bitter lesson of Red Mountain repeating itself one final time at the very summit where that lesson was first learned. Whatever choice a traveller ultimately makes standing at the edge of that ancient quarrel, the silent order atop the throat of the world endures regardless, keeping their long and patient vigil exactly as they always have, waiting through the wind and the snow for whatever the turning of the next age might eventually bring them.